Over here, Dallas.
Oh, Dallas.
Hey, on the comment of the lunar settlement studies or the infrastructure needed, the AIM studies in 78, 79 related to L5 cities, they did a great job of characterizing what a community needed in terms of square footage per population unit. So there's a great list in one of those study books to go research. I've got it at home. I can't remember the title or the year.
The title is Space Settlements.
Space Settlements Design Study.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That was what I was referring to.
And then the ILLIWIG, the International Lunar Exploration Working Group, about that same era, was looking at bases, settlements in the orders of magnitude steps, tens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands on the moon. Right. So there may be something there too.
I think Wendell referred to one of the ones he did too.
One thing I wanted to mention, I've been reading a new book that came out that really isn't anything to do with NewSpace, but it really associates with the mentality of this group, and that's The Rational Optimist. And this book talks about why the human species prospered. And it really gives a tremendous number of examples about how isolation and the size of settlement makes a big difference. And that's something that I think we really need to consider when we look at permanence.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that. In the Antarctic, we have permanence, but no individual stays for very long. So the longest tour of duty of an individual is a year. Most people go down for several months. So there have been U.S. crew at South Pole continuously for 55 years, so it's permanence, but nobody's been there for 55 years, and crews come and go. And certainly for the moon, that's possible. We could have a base on the moon, and we could send grad students up there 6 months doing field research, and they come back to Earth, work in their university for a couple of years, and they go back to the moon for another 6 months of field research. Then they publish their dissertation, and they go and get a real job. So that model that model can be permanent without having a separate, dislocated community. It's in communication and flux with the community back here. The major advisor of that grad student might go up for a couple days to see what their research is, just the way we do in Antarctica. You know, most of the researchers there are graduate students doing their PhD research. Their advisors show up occasionally and walk around like they know what they're talking about and leave. Right? So it's not a isolated fragment of a different community. It's communication and interchange with this community, and it's still permanent. And that's the model, at least the science model, that I would push certainly for the moon. The moon is close enough that you can do that model very effectively. In fact, it's faster to get to the moon than it is to get to Antarctica because of unpredictability of the weather. The last time I went to Antarctica, it took me 10 days from my house to McMurdo Station. And we can get to the moon faster than that. There's no weather between here and the moon, so it's actually easier to schedule flights back and from the moon than it is to Antarctica.
You know, one of the models of the government-private sector cooperation, it's been talked about before, was the idea of the old, the frontier outpost idea, where the government establishes its permanent facility out in the frontier, establishes, using economic means, private carriers and this and that, the transportation to and from that outpost in the frontier. The government people in the outpost, you know, in the Old West, it might have been the cavalry and the army, are doing their thing by their rules inside. And then what gradually starts to spring up outside are the trading posts. And they're using the same pipelines, shall we say, back and forth to the rest of the culture. They're trading to and from the people in the fort. And what happens is then you cut to 150 or 200 years later, and you, in this particular model, you've got a quaint historic monument of the original fort in the center of the town, and then there's this giant city built around it. And that's a good model of permanence and settlement, how they can work together. And by the way, the economics of that city are now driving new science, new universities, new educational activities and things like that. One last comment I want to make on the thing that Dallas mentioned. Isn't it interesting that at that time in the late 70s, when we were anticipating the shuttle and anticipating space stations that the government was interested in, the government was actually willing to pay. What was it, $1 million for some of those studies, or the O'Neill studies, things like that? There was a lot of money to put a lot of minds on that had nothing to do directly in the path of what the government was going to build, but would help create a broader story, I think it was, that we're still feeding off of almost 25 years later.
Yeah, that was at Ames.
Yeah.
Ames is known for being full of crazy folks.
We love it.
I'm the one exception, of course.
I don't know if Pete would argue with you. But